People don't punish you by being cruel. They punish you by continuing to be kind while you're not looking. I know that now the way you know a bruise is there, by pressing on it and finding out it still works. The lawyer's letter was dated March the 3rd, and March the 3rd was the same week, 4 years running, that I had made sure my mother was not on the guest list for anything that mattered to me. Not my son's christening. Not my 32nd birthday, the one with the backyard string lights. Not one single Thanksgiving in 6 years. I want to say that plainly, without dressing it up, because dressing it up is what I did for a long time, and it's why it took me this long to understand what I'd actually done. I cut my mother out of every family event I hosted for 6 straight years, and I told everyone, including myself, that she deserved it. My name is Rachel Voss. I'm 34. I live in Portland, Oregon, in a house in the Alberta Arts District, with a mortgage I refinanced twice, and until 11 months ago, I worked as a senior loan officer at a regional bank downtown, the kind of job where you learn to say unfortunately, based on the numbers in a voice that doesn't shake. I'm telling you my job first, because it matters to the story. It isn't incidental. Everything that happened partly because of who I decided to become at that bank, and who I decided my mother could no longer be to me because of it. But I need to back up. You need to understand how it started, because if I just tell you the ending, you'll think I'm a monster, and the truth is worse than that. The truth is, I'm ordinary, and ordinary is how this kind of thing usually happens. Nobody wakes up one day deciding to lock a parent out of her own grandson's life. You get there one small, defensible decision at a time, and I made every single one of them feeling perfectly reasonable while I made it. My mother's name was Diane Voss. She ran a shop called Diane's Stitch and Mend on Fremont Street, in the same storefront for 26 years, sandwiched between a laundromat and a shop that sold, at various points in my childhood, either lamps or vacuum parts. I could never keep track, and I don't think the owner could either. She did alterations, mostly hems, zippers. The occasional wedding dress some bride had bought 2 sizes too small on purpose, for motivation, and then needed let out 3 weeks before the ceremony because motivation doesn't actually work that way. She kept a coffee can full of loose buttons on the counter, sorted by nothing, and regular customers used to dig through it looking for a match while they waited. And she never once told them to hurry up. She had a habit I didn't think about for 30 years and think about constantly now. Before any of us left the house for something that mattered, she'd check our coats. Not our hair, not our shoes, our coats. She'd run her thumb down the row of buttons, and if one was loose, she'd disappear into the sewing room for 90 seconds and come back with it resewn. Tight. Done. Without a word. You'd just find out later that the button that had been wobbling all week was suddenly solid, and by the time you noticed, she'd already be back at the stove or the machine, not looking for credit, not mentioning it. Like it embarrassed her to be caught doing something kind. She used to say, when I was a teenager and impatient with her for making me late for the bus, "You don't have to see it holding, you just have to know it will." I thought for years that was a saying about buttons. It was not a saying about buttons. The other thing she did, every single time any of us left her house, coat on, keys in hand, was slip a $20 bill into the coat pocket. Not handed to us, slipped in while we were saying goodbye at the door, silent, so you'd find it later, usually at the worst possible moment, paying for gas you thought you couldn't afford, or covering a coffee when your card declined out of pure embarrassment in front of someone you were trying to impress. She did this until the day I stopped letting her close enough to my coat to do it. There were 3 of us who mattered in this story, growing up. My mother, my younger sister Lisa, and me. My father left when I was 9, and Lisa was 6, A slow leaving, not a dramatic one, a man who took a sales job that required travel and then simply required more of it every year, until one day the travel didn't come back to Portland at all. After that, my mother ran the shop and raised us essentially alone, working 6 days a week, and I want to say clearly that this was hard. Because I spent a long time acting like it wasn't, like she'd had it easy, like the shop was a hobby, instead of the thing that kept the lights on. My father, for what it's worth, was not a villain either, just a man who found it easier to keep extending a work trip than to come home to a house with 2 kids and a wife who was tired in a way he didn't know how to help with. He sent birthday cards for a few years and then didn't, and by the time I was in high school he was a name more than a person, and my mother never once, in my hearing, said a bitter word about him in front of us. Which I understood as strength at the time and understand now might also have been its own kind of exhaustion. She simply didn't have the energy left over to build a case against him, on top of everything else she was holding up alone. Lisa and I split down a fault line early. She was the daughter who stayed close, who called on Sundays at exactly 6 o'clock, who worked the counter at the shop through high school and college breaks, who knew the names of my mother's regular customers. I was the daughter who left for college in California on a partial scholarship and came back changed in a way my mother never quite said out loud that she noticed, though she did. Lisa liked being the closer daughter. I don't say that as an accusation, I say it because it's true, and because it matters later. Being the one who stayed meant something to her, and somewhere along the way, being the one who stayed started to require, in her private accounting of things, that I be the one who left. It's easier to be needed by a parent if there's another sibling who very visibly isn't around to be needed. I didn't understand that math until much later. At the time, I just understood that Lisa always had a comment ready. She didn't even ask about you this week, dropped light and quick over the phone, like she was doing me a favor by keeping me updated on my own irrelevance. When really, I think now, she was protecting a role she'd built for herself and needed me to keep failing at mine to keep it standing. I should tell you one more thing about her before I get to the part where I stop deserving her, because it's the detail I come back to most now. When I was 11, I broke my arm falling off a neighbor's fence, the kind of break that needed a cast for 6 weeks in the middle of summer, and my mother, who could not afford to close the shop for even a single day, brought a folding chair and a card table into the alley behind the storefront so I could sit in the shade near the back door while she worked the counter inside, checking on me every 20 minutes through the propped open screen door. She didn't apologize for not being able to take me somewhere more fun. She just brought out lemonade in a thermos and a stack of magazines from the laundromat next door, and at the end of each day she'd sit with me on the alley steps for exactly as long as it took to eat a sandwich. No more, because there was always a hem-do the next morning. I didn't understand, at 11, that this was the shape her love actually took, proximity instead of grand gestures. Small, unglamorous adjustments made so that nobody around her had to ask for help out loud. I understood it, at the time, as her being too busy for me. Both of those things were true at once, and for a long stretch of my adult life I only ever let myself remember the second one. I remember the exact afternoon that fault line first showed itself clearly, though I didn't have language for it then. I was 16, home from a summer program I'd begged my mother to help pay for, and Lisa, 13, had spent that same summer working the shop counter for free because my mother needed the extra pair of hands more than she needed to pay for one. When I got back, Lisa said, in front of our mother, not quite joking, "Must be nice to get to leave," and my mother, exhausted, said nothing to correct her, just kept sorting buttons into the coffee can, and I remember feeling both defended and not defended at once, The way you do when a parent's silence could mean either that's not fair to your sister or she has a point, and you're never quite sure which one you're supposed to hear. The precipitating event, if you want to call it that, happened at my engagement dinner 9 years ago at a restaurant in the Pearl District I had picked specifically because my fiancé David's parents were the kind of people who noticed restaurants, the kind who'd comment quietly to each other about a wine list, and I wanted, badly, for my mother's presence not to cost me anything with them. My mother came straight from the shop. She still had a faint strip of chalk dust on the cuff of her blazer, the kind she used for marking hems, and at some point during the appetizers, David's father's shirt collar flipped up wrong on one side, and my mother reached over, without asking, and fixed it, tucked it flat, smoothed it. The way she'd have fixed anyone's collar her whole professional life, on pure instinct, the way some people reach out to catch a glass before it tips. He laughed it off, a little startled, good-natured about it. His wife did not laugh it off. She said, "Well, aren't you handy?" in a tone I understood immediately, the tone people use when they've decided something about you and are being polite enough not to say it directly. And I sat there and felt, for the first time with real clarity, ashamed of my own mother in a room full of people whose approval I had already decided I needed more than I needed her. I didn't say anything that night. That's important, because for years afterward I told the story as though she'd embarrassed me on purpose, as though it had been some act of aggression against my dignity, when what actually happened is that she'd done something tender and reflexive in a room that had no use for tenderness, and I let a stranger's flicker of discomfort become the lens through which I reread my own mother. Permanently, for the better part of a decade. That's the backstory. Here's the wrongdoing, and I'm not going to soften it, because softening it is exactly what I did at the time, and softening it is the whole reason it lasted 6 years instead of 6 weeks. 14 months after the engagement dinner, I got married. I did not invite my mother to the rehearsal dinner. I told her the venue had a strict head count, which was a lie. There were 4 empty seats at the head table alone, and I told her she was welcome at the ceremony itself, in the back, and that we'd see how the timing worked for the reception toast. My new mother-in-law gave the toast that was supposed to be my mother's, a toast about watching me grow up, delivered by a woman who had known me for 2 years. I watched my actual mother clap for it from a folding chair near the coat check, in a navy dress she'd altered herself to fit. I recognized her own stitching along the waist seam even from across the room, and I remember thinking, with a coldness that still surprises me when I recall it accurately instead of the way I used to recall it, that she looked out of place there, small and out of place, and that this was somehow her failing and not a single choice I had made. That was the first exclusion. It was not the last, and each one after that got easier, the way any cruelty gets easier once you've built a story that makes it necessary. The story I built was this. My mother was embarrassing. My mother didn't understand who I was becoming. My mother would rather humiliate me in front of people who mattered than adapt herself even slightly, and every time she reached toward me, I treated the reach itself as the offense. When my son Owen was born, 2 years later, I didn't call her from the hospital. Lisa did on my behalf, and, she says accidentally, though I never pressed her hard enough to find out whether it was, told her the wrong hospital. My mother figured out the correct one herself and showed up 11 hours after Owen was born, and I told the nurse at the front desk, in front of David, that we weren't ready for visitors yet. I could see my mother through the little rectangular window in the door to the recovery wing. She waited 40 minutes in that hallway, sitting in one of the vinyl chairs with her purse in her lap, and then she left. She sent a card 2 days later with a $50 savings bond for the baby and no note beyond congratulations. Love, Mom. I put the bond in a drawer. I did not call her. There's a third scene from that first year I need to give you, because it's the one where I stopped being able to tell myself the exclusions were accidental, logistical, a matter of head counts and timing. The Thanksgiving after Owen was born, my mother showed up at my house uninvited, on foot, having taken 2 buses because her car still wasn't running, carrying a pie in a foil pan balanced on one arm and a diaper bag she'd bought secondhand and mended the strap on herself balanced on the other. I saw her through the front window before she reached the porch. I had 12 guests inside, including David's parents, and I remember the exact thought I had, standing at that window, which was not "my mother is here," but how do I explain this? I went out onto the porch instead of letting her in. She stood at the bottom of the steps, not climbing them, like she already understood she wasn't meant to. "I know I should have called," she said. "I just wanted to see him." I brought a pie. I told her it wasn't a good time, that we were mid-meal, that I'd bring some food by for her later in the week, which I did not do. She nodded, the way she used to nod at difficult customers who wanted more taken in than the fabric allowed. A nod that meant she'd heard the actual answer underneath the polite one. She said, "Okay, tell Owen happy first Thanksgiving," and turned around and walked back down the block toward the bus stop with the pie still in her arms, because I hadn't taken it from her, and I stood on that porch and watched her go, and then went back inside and told my in-laws it had been someone collecting for a church group. Here is the professional part, because it's the part I've had to sit with the longest, and it's the part that finally explains the title of this story better than anything else I can tell you. Around that same time, I was 3 years into my job at the bank, and I was good at it in the specific way that gets rewarded before anyone checks how you got good. I closed loans fast, my portfolio looked clean on every quarterly report, and my supervisor, a man named Carl Petrie, 61 years old, close to retirement. The kind of manager who liked being able to brag about his team more than he liked digging into the details of how the numbers got made, used to introduce me to visiting regional executives as the one who doesn't miss. What nobody in that building knew, including, for a while, me, if I'm honest about how gradually these things creep, is that I had started rounding numbers. Not stealing, not in the beginning. Rounding, a borderline debt-to-income ratio adjusted here, a slightly generous appraisal figure accepted there, each one small enough that no single file would ever get flagged on its own, cumulative enough that by year 4 I had a stack of loans that would not survive a genuine audit. I told myself I was helping people get approved who deserved a chance and just didn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. That was true of some of them. It was also, I understand now, a story I needed in order to keep doing something I already knew underneath the story was wrong. I can give you one specific file, because the vague version of I rounded some numbers doesn't carry the weight the actual decisions did. There was a couple, the Hendersons, refinancing a small rental property whose debt-to-income ratio came in 4 points over what our internal guidelines allowed, a gap that should have meant a decline or, at minimum, a request for additional documentation that would have delayed their closing by weeks. I adjusted the reported ratio using a projected rental income figure that was technically permissible under a narrow reading of the guidelines and actually far more optimistic than any reasonable appraiser would have signed off on, because the Hendersons were a referral from a real estate agent who sent me steady business, and because closing that file fast made my quarterly numbers look better. And because, if I'm honest, doing it once and getting away with it made doing it a second time, on a different file, feel less like a decision and more like a pattern I was already inside of. There were, by the time of the internal review, 11 files like that in 3 years. I told myself at the time that none of them had actually defaulted, which was true. and which I mistook for evidence that what I'd done wasn't really wrong, instead of evidence that I'd simply been lucky. There was a night, about 6 months before the review, before I knew there'd been a review, before I knew any of this, when Carl mentioned, almost offhand, locking up the office, that corporate's been sniffing around a few branches doing sample audits, nothing to worry about. Probably, I remember the specific, physical drop in my stomach at that sentence, a full-body understanding that I should say something to him right then, in that hallway, while it might still have been a conversation instead of a discovery. I opened my mouth. I said, "Anything I should know about?" Instead of the sentence I'd actually opened my mouth to say. And he said, "Nah. You're clean. You're the one who doesn't miss, remember," and clapped me once on the shoulder on his way to the elevator, and I let that be the end of it. Because it was easier to let him believe it than to make it true. My mother came to me during this same stretch, the only time in 6 years she asked me for anything directly instead of routing it through Lisa. Her shop's lease was up for renewal, and the landlord had raised the rent 40% in a single jump, citing market rate, and she needed an $11,000 bridge loan to cover 2 new sewing machines and 3 months of the increased rent while she rebuilt her client base at the new pricing. She came to my branch on a Tuesday afternoon. She wore the navy dress. She sat across the desk from me, in my own office, and asked me, her daughter, the loan officer, for help. I want you to understand the off-ramp clearly here, because this is the moment the whole story turns on, more than the wedding, more than the hospital. I could have approved that loan in under 2 minutes. Her credit was fine. Her collateral was fine. It was, professionally, an easy, uncomplicated yes, and it would have cost me nothing. Not money, not reputation, nothing. Instead, I told her that per bank policy, I couldn't personally process a loan for an immediate family member, which was technically true, but which also, in practice, meant nothing, because the actual policy simply required disclosure and reassignment to another loan officer. A form and a signature, an afternoon's worth of paperwork. Carl would have handled it without blinking. I knew that. I did not offer it to her. I told her instead that I'd look into other options, and then I did not look into other options. 3 weeks later, her landlord filed to terminate the lease over the missed increase. She lost the storefront on Fremont Street after 26 years in the same location. She moved the entire business into her one-car garage, sewing machines lined up where a car used to fit, a portable heater running through the winter because the garage wasn't insulated. I did not go help her move a single box. I told myself, in the specific language I used at the time, that I was maintaining a professional boundary. I told Lisa, when she called me furious about it, that Mom needed to learn to manage her own finances instead of leaning on family for every setback. I used the word boundary so many times that year that it stopped meaning anything except the thing I am doing instead of the thing I actually owe her. There's one more scene from this period I want to give you, because it's the one I've replayed most since. About 4 months after the lease fell through, my mother called the bank's main line, not my direct line, and asked to speak to whoever handles small business loans, because she didn't want to put me in an awkward position by asking me directly again. She got Carl. Carl, who'd known her casually for years through the neighborhood, told her he'd look at getting her something through a community development program the bank participated in, a lower barrier product meant for exactly her situation. He mentioned it to me the next day, in the break room, half in passing. "Your mom called in, by the way. Nice lady. I think we can get her something through the C-DeFi partnership. I'll loop you in." And I told him, flatly, not to loop me in, that it was a personal matter and I'd rather keep it separate. I don't know if he ever followed up with her after that. I never asked. I told myself asking would look needy. 6 years. That's the long stretch, the frozen part, and I want to walk through it honestly, because the version of me in those years was not miserable, and that's the part people don't expect. I was, by every visible measure, thriving. I got promoted twice, once to senior loan officer, once to a title with portfolio in it that came with a small office instead of a cubicle. My marriage was stable. Owen turned 4, then 6, then 8. I hosted a 4th of July barbecue every single year with 20-some guests, string lights, a caterer for the pulled pork the last 3 years, and my mother was invited to none of them. When people asked, casually, "Is your mom coming?" I had a line ready, delivered flat and closed on purpose to end the conversation. "We're not close right now." I credited my own success, privately, to having simplified my life. I actually used that word in my own head. Simplified, as though my mother had been clutter I'd finally cleared out to make room for who I was supposed to become. There were cracks in that thriving, small ones, and I want to name them because I didn't let myself feel them fully at the time, and now I can't stop feeling them. My mother called me on a Sunday afternoon in the 3rd year of the freeze, and I watched the phone ring on the kitchen counter while I finished loading the dishwasher, and I let it go to voicemail, and I never called back. The message, when I finally listened to it 8 months later, going through old voicemails for an unrelated reason, just said, "Hi honey, it's Mom. Just checking in. No reason, just wanted to hear your voice. Okay, love you. Bye." Oh, it's Mom, like she'd forgotten she'd already said so, the way people do when they're nervous leaving a message for someone who might not want to hear from them. I heard, through Lisa, secondhand, that my mother had a bad flu the winter of year 4 and ran the shop out of the garage anyway because she couldn't afford to close for a week without falling behind on the equipment loan she'd eventually taken out on her own, at a worse rate than I could have given her. I heard, another time, that she'd started walking to the bus stop instead of driving because her car needed a transmission repair she kept putting off. 4 blocks each way in the rain, a woman in her late 50s carrying a bag of pinned garments to deliver by hand because the shop no longer had a storefront customers could just walk into. Each of these facts arrived to me the way weather reports arrive about a city you used to live in, sad in an abstract, weather report way, unrelated to any action I might actually take. Twice, over those 6 years, I actually dialed her number and let it ring once before hanging up, my thumb moving faster than whatever I was telling myself I intended. I told myself, both times, that I was busy. I was not busy in the way that mattered. In year 5, Lisa mentioned in the middle of an unrelated conversation about something else entirely that our mother had started getting winded walking up the single flight of stairs to her apartment and had gone to a walk-in clinic instead of a regular doctor because she didn't have a regular doctor anymore. Hadn't for years. And had been told to watch her blood pressure and given a pamphlet instead of a real workup, because the walk-in clinic was what her insurance, thin as it was after losing the storefront's group plan, actually covered. I registered this the way I registered most news about her by then, a small flicker of concern, filed and closed within the hour. Because acting on it would have meant admitting the freeze was costing her something real instead of something she'd brought on herself. Which was still, at that point, the story I needed to keep telling. The closest I came to breaking the freeze happened in year 5, at Owen's school winter concert. I saw a woman in the 3rd row who I was almost certain, from behind, was my mother. Same posture, same way of holding a coat folded over her knees instead of on the seat back, and my chest did something involuntary, something that had nothing to do with the story I'd built. I stood there in the aisle for a long moment, deciding whether to go say something, whether Lisa had told her the date, whether it would even be her. By the time I worked up something like courage, the lights had dimmed for the first song, and afterward the woman was gone before I could get through the crowd, and I told myself it probably hadn't been her at all, and I let that be a relief instead of a loss. By year 6, I had stopped mentioning her at all, even in the flat, closed way I used to. When my team at the bank threw me a small party for my second promotion, Carl stood up and gave a little speech about how far I'd come, from a green associate to somebody I'd trust with my own mortgage. And everyone laughed, and I remember thinking, with something that should have alarmed me more than it did, that the version of myself being celebrated in that room had been built, in part, on money my mother had quietly repaid without my ever finding out there was anything to repay. I didn't know that yet, not with facts, but some low animal instinct in me flinched at the word trust that night in a way I couldn't explain and didn't investigate. That same year, Owen asked me, out of nowhere, buckled into his booster seat on the way home from school, "Do I have another grandma? Emma at school has two." I told him my mother lived far away and we didn't see her much, which was not true in either direction. She lived 4 miles from us, and the reason we didn't see her had nothing to do with distance. He accepted the answer the way 8-year-olds accept most adult answers, without pressing, and I remember gripping the steering wheel a little tighter for the rest of that drive and telling myself I'd revisit it when things were less complicated. A sentence I said to myself so often over those years that it stopped meaning anything at all. Then, 11 months ago on a Tuesday afternoon, I got a call from a man named Arthur Kessler, an estate attorney in Southeast Portland I had never heard of. He asked, gently, if I was somewhere I could sit down for a minute, which is a phrase I now understand people only use right before the floor changes shape underneath you. My mother had died 4 days earlier. A stroke, at home, alone, in the garage that had been her workshop for the last 6 years of her life, found by Lisa, who'd let herself in with her spare key when 3 days of unanswered calls felt wrong. Lisa had known for 4 days and had not called me. When I asked her why, later in the parking lot of the funeral home, in a voice I didn't recognize as my own, she said, "Quiet. Not cruel. Just tired in a way that scared me more than anger would have. I didn't know how to tell you something you'd stopped being part of." I've turned that sentence over more times in 11 months than almost anything else in this story. The funeral was small, the shop's regulars, 2 women my mother had gone to church with decades earlier, a handful of neighbors from Fremont Street who remembered the storefront, Lisa's family, mine. I stood in the back, near the coat rack by the door, which I understood, standing there in a black dress with my hand resting on a stranger's jacket sleeve for balance, to be an almost unbearably precise piece of symmetry, because it was exactly where she had stood at my wedding. The will reading was 2 weeks later in Arthur Kessler's office, a narrow room with a window that looked out onto the side of a parking structure instead of the street. Lisa was there, in the chair beside mine, not quite looking at me. Arthur had a manila folder that was thicker than I expected for what I'd assumed would be a short, simple estate. A woman who'd run a garage sewing business for the last 6 years of her life and rented a 1-bedroom apartment on Sandy Boulevard didn't strike me as someone with much to divide. He read through the will itself fairly quickly. The apartment's furniture and contents split evenly between Lisa and me, with a note that I should take the kitchen table, specifically, because Rachel always liked the corner where the light comes in, a detail that made my throat close in a way I wasn't prepared for in front of a stranger's desk. The sewing machines and the remaining client list went to Lisa, who still worked the business. And to me, specifically, by name, a locked wooden box, 4 inches by 6, cedar, that Arthur said my mother had left with explicit written instructions that it go to me and to no one else, that it not be opened by anyone but me, and that he was not to describe its contents to Lisa or to anyone in the family, only to place it in my hands, sealed, at the reading. I opened it in the car, in the parking structure, alone, because I could not make myself wait until I got home, and some part of me, some old animal part, already understood that whatever was in that box was going to require privacy. Inside was a composition notebook, plain black and white marbled cover, filled with dated entries going back 11 years in my mother's handwriting. The same handwriting from every birthday card I'd stopped opening carefully. And folded on top of the notebook, a single official document, 3 pages, a letter on my own bank's letterhead from the Internal Compliance Office, dated 7 years earlier, addressed not to me, but to Diane Voss. It was a restitution acknowledgement, $11,400, paid in full in cash installments over 14 months, to satisfy what the letter called a shortfall identified during an internal quality review tied to a loan file bearing my own employee identification number. My name did not appear anywhere on the letter itself. Hers was the only signature on the acknowledgement of payment. I sat in that parking structure for 40 minutes, reading entry by entry, before I understood fully what I was looking at. 7 years earlier, the same year I'd told her, sitting in my own office, that I couldn't process her business loan, there had been an internal review at my branch. A real one. Quiet. The kind that happens before a bigger one, where a compliance officer pulls a random sample of files and finds enough irregularities in one loan officer's book that it requires quiet remediation before it escalates into a formal audit, the kind that ends careers and sometimes triggers referrals to state banking regulators. My file had been pulled in that sample. Carl Petrie had handled the finding internally, off the record of any real disciplinary file, on the condition that the shortfall be made whole quietly and quickly before the next scheduled formal audit cycle, so that it would read on paper as a clerical correction instead of what it actually was. I never knew any of this had happened. I genuinely believed, up until 11 months ago, that period of my career had simply been clean, that I'd gotten away with something through luck rather than through the deliberate, expensive silence of another person. My mother had found out. I still don't fully know how she learned of it before it became public inside the branch. The ledger has one entry, dated that same month, that just reads, Carl P. called. Rachel doesn't know. Keep it that way. I understand now that Carl, an old acquaintance of hers from decades back in the neighborhood, someone she'd hemmed pants for since he was a young man just starting at the branch, had done her one enormous, quiet favor. He warned her instead of simply reporting the full finding up the chain, and gave her a window to make it right before it became unfixable for me. She sold her car that same season, the one with the transmission she'd been putting off repairing. Sold as is for less than it was worth, because a sale that fast doesn't wait for a good price. She took out a second, smaller loan against the 2 sewing machines she had just bought with money she didn't have, the very equipment she'd needed the loan I refused her in order to purchase in the first place. She worked 6-day weeks out of that garage at 60 years old, walking to the bus stop because she could not afford both gas and a monthly payment in the same month in order to pay off, in cash installments to a compliance office at my own employer, a debt that was mine, that I had created, in the very same year I was refusing to help her keep her own storefront open. The last entry in the notebook, dated the week of Owen's christening, 4 years ago, said only this: didn't invite us again. That's all right. She's still standing at that bank. That's the only part that was ever mine to keep holding up. You don't have to see it holding. You just have to know it will. I understood, sitting in that parking garage with the engine off and the box open in my lap, that I had spent 6 years punishing a woman for a coldness I'd invented out of one flipped-up collar at a dinner 9 years earlier, while she spent those same 6 years quietly absorbing a consequence I had actually earned and never had to face, and she did it without once telling me. Without once using it to win an argument, without once mentioning it during the single time she'd asked me for real help and I had turned her away with a lie about bank policy. I called Lisa from that parking structure before I did anything else, still sitting in the driver's seat with the box open on the passenger side, and I asked her, straight out, whether she'd known any of it. She was quiet long enough that I understood the answer before she said it. I knew some of it, she said finally. Not the bank part. I knew about the car. I knew she was doing extra alterations on the side for cash, late at night, and I thought it was just because business was slow after she lost the storefront. She told me not to tell you any of it was hard. She said, and I remember this exactly, Rachel's got enough going on. Don't make her feel bad about something that isn't her problem. I sat with the phone against my ear and didn't say anything for a long time, and Lisa, to her credit, didn't fill the silence either. She just let it sit there, the way our mother used to let a difficult customer's silence sit there, instead of rushing to smooth it over. I went back through the earlier entries after that, and they got smaller, and somehow that made them worse. A note about the $20 bills, dated the year after the freeze started, still put one in her old coat. The one on the hook by my door, out of habit. Don't know why I keep it there. Maybe for when she's ready. A note from the drawer Lisa found later and gave to me. 11 envelopes, sealed, each addressed to me in my mother's handwriting, never mailed. $220 total inside them. $10 more than the $20 habit would have accounted for, as if some months she doubled it without saying why. A note from the year of the engagement dinner itself, written that same night, I think, given the date, fixed the cane's collar without thinking, the way I always do. Saw Rachel's face after. I understand. I'll be smaller next time. I don't want to cost her anything. She had made herself smaller. On purpose, for years. I had experienced her getting smaller, quieter at the wedding, absent from the hospital hallway, invisible at the school concert, as her finally understanding her place, when it had actually been a woman trying, in the only language available to her, to stop costing her daughter comfort, even as that same daughter's carelessness was actively costing her a business, a car, and finally her health. There was one more entry, dated Owen's 6th birthday, the year of the backyard string lights and the caterer for the pulled pork, that I had to read 3 times before I could make myself understand it. Drove past the party today. Didn't stop. Balloons on the mailbox, could hear the music from the street. Left a 20 in an envelope in their mailbox for O. Unsigned, so R. Wouldn't have to decide whether to send it back. I had found that envelope. Actually, I remembered it now, standing in the kitchen holding it. No return address. $20 and a small folded paper animal, an origami rabbit, no note, and I had assumed, at the time, that it was from one of David's co-workers who liked kids. And I'd let Owen keep the rabbit and put the 20 toward the caterer's tip without a second thought about where either had come from. She had stood at the curb of my son's birthday party, having walked or taken a bus to get there, listened to the music she wasn't invited to, and left before anyone could see her, so that I would never have to make the decision to turn her away in person again. She had already made that decision easy for me, the way she'd made almost everything easy for me for 6 straight years, while I made almost nothing easy for her in return. I confronted what I'd told myself, sitting there in that parked car, and it did not survive one plain question, asked out loud, to no one. What had she actually done to me, ever, that deserved 6 years of locked doors? A ruffled collar at a dinner. A missed pickup that Lisa admitted, years later, in an unguarded moment, might not have been quite the honest mistake she'd claimed. A woman reaching for her daughter in the only ways she knew how, mending, cash tucked into a coat pocket, a checked collar at a stranger's request, and a daughter who had quietly decided that the reaching itself was the offense worth punishing. I thought, too, about the walk-in clinic pamphlet Lisa had mentioned in year 5, and did the math I hadn't let myself do at the time. That the blood pressure she was told to watch was very likely made worse by 6 years of standing on cold concrete in an uninsulated garage, 6 years of walking to bus stops in the rain because a car repair competed with a business loan payment I could have prevented her from ever needing. 6 years of stress that had a name and a cause, and a daughter's signature on the cause. Even if my actual signature never appeared on a single document. I don't know, and will never know, whether a different 6 years would have meant more years with her at all. I don't let myself claim that certainty, because it would be its own kind of tidy story, and I've done enough damage with tidy stories already. What I do know, without needing to claim more than this, is that I made the 6 years she did have measurably harder, and that she spent them making mine measurably easier, and that the ledger of that exchange will never balance, no matter what I do from here. There is no living confrontation scene in this story, and I can't fix that by writing myself a better ending. The reckoning I get is with an empty garage, a locked cedar box, and a compliance letter with someone else's debt paid off in her own handwriting. I went to that garage once, before Lisa finished clearing it out, and stood at the workbench where the coroner said she'd died. Sewing machine still threaded, a pair of unfinished trousers, still pinned at the hem, on the dress form beside it, and I said, out loud, to no one, in a voice that came out much smaller than I expected, I knew. I think some part of me always knew you'd cover for me, even while I was locking you out. That's actually the worst part of all of this. I counted on you catching me, quietly, while I was busy punishing you for existing loudly. Nobody answered. The heater ticked as it cooled. That was the whole scene. That was the confrontation I get. What I have done since, over these 11 months, is not a clean repair, and I want to be honest about that too, because a tidy ending would be its own kind of lie, and this format, if it's honest, doesn't deal in those. I gave the restitution money's equivalent back, not to my mother, who is gone, but into an account for Owen's education, in her name, the Diane Voss Fund. Because giving it to some general charity felt like erasing what it had specifically cost her, and simply keeping it felt unbearable in a way I couldn't have articulated to anyone but Arthur Kessler, who helped me set it up without asking why. Lisa and I are rebuilding something, slower than I want it to go, and slower than I have any right to expect. She still, some weeks, won't take my calls on the first ring, and when I asked her, about 6 months in, sitting across from her at the kitchen table our mother had specifically willed to me, whether she could ever really forgive how I'd treated our mother, she looked at the corner where the light comes in and said, I'm not there yet. Ask me again next year, and then she got up and put the kettle on, which I've come to understand from her is its own kind of answer, not forgiveness, but not a door closing either. I took over 3 of my mother's old alteration clients, the ones who didn't yet know she died and kept calling the old shop line, which now forwards to my cell phone. The first one, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Okafor, who'd been bringing my mother her church dresses for 11 years, cried on the phone when I told her, and then, a week later, dropped off a dress for me to hem anyway, because Diane would want the work to keep going, not the grief. she said, standing on my porch in almost exactly the spot where my mother had once stood with an uneaten pie. I botched that first hem badly enough that I had to redo it twice, and Mrs. Okafor waited in my kitchen both times, patient in a way that felt like a small, undeserved mercy, and told me stories about my mother I'd never heard. How she used to let customers who couldn't pay full price work it off answering phones for an afternoon instead. How she once stayed open until 9 on a Tuesday so a nursing student could pick up her only interview blazer before a morning flight. I've been learning, badly, at 34 years old, how to hem a pair of pants on the machine Lisa let me keep, the older of the two, the one with a chip in the housing from some accident decades before I was born that my mother never explained. I am not good at it. My seams pucker. My mother would have laughed, not unkindly, at exactly how bad I am at something she made look effortless for 40 years. Lisa and I have started having dinner together every other Sunday at 6 o'clock, the same hour she used to call our mother, which I don't think either of us has said out loud is the reason we picked that time. It is slow, and it is not always warm. 2 months ago, she told me, over dishes neither of us had touched much, that she'd spent years half enjoying being the good daughter because it was the only currency she had against a sister who'd left for California and never seemed to look back, and that watching me finally look back, now when it was too late for it to cost me anything real, made her angrier than watching me stay away ever had. I didn't defend myself. I said, "That's fair," and meant it, and we sat with that for a while, and then she asked if I wanted the rest of the dumplings, and I understood that to be, for now, as close to peace as we were going to get, and I took it. I told Owen about the fund the week we set it up, in simple terms, that it was named for a grandmother he'd barely met, and that some of the money in it had once belonged to her, and that she'd worked very hard, in a small garage, to make sure it existed at all. He asked, reasonably, why he'd never met her much, and I didn't give him the easy answer this time. I said, because I made some choices that kept you two apart, and I'm sorry for that, and I'm trying to make sure I don't make choices like that again. He's 9. He didn't fully understand it, and he went back to his cereal within about a minute, the way kids do, but I've noticed since then that he asks about her sometimes, unprompted, whether she liked dogs, what her voice sounded like, and I answer every question fully now, in detail, instead of the short, flat sentences I used to give when the topic was simply something to be closed. 2 months ago, going through the cedar box one more time, I found, tucked into a fold at the very bottom beneath the notebook, a single coat button, wrapped loosely in a scrap of navy thread, no note attached, no explanation of which coat it had come from, or when she'd meant to fix it. I don't know if it was meant for me at all, or if it was simply an old habit she never finished. The way a seamstress's workroom always has one project pinned and waiting. I've kept it in a small dish on my dresser since, and some mornings before I leave the house, I look at it, and then I check Owen's coat collar the way she used to check mine, running my thumb down the row of buttons, and if one is loose, I fix it in the other room. Quickly, without making an announcement of it. And I don't wait around afterward for him to notice. Here is what I know now that I did not know then, and I'll say it once, plainly, and then I'll stop. Because I've already said more than one moral tonight, and this format only allows me the one that counts. The people who love you the most rarely announce the cost of loving you. They just keep the thread holding, quietly, on the other side of a door you've locked against them. And they let you go on believing you did it entirely on your own. Because your pride mattered more to them in the moment than your gratitude ever could have. You very often don't find out what someone protected you from until it's too late to thank them properly for it. And by then, the only honest thing left to do is stop doing to the next person what you spent 6 years doing to her, while you still have the chance to. If this story moved you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more honest, family-centered stories.